So my understanding is that you first had the idea for the project in 1975, and it took obviously a few years to get to.
Well, in terms of the inspiration, I was 71. I came to the London Film School, and then after about 4 years, I had the idea of going back to Chicago, where I grew up, and doing a documentary about blues in Chicago, and which the BBC then showed many times. And it was there, back in Chicago, which is a city kind of webbed with highways, that I was just struck by the size of the vehicles, and I started being a lifelong science fiction fan. The notion of this story began there, and I worked with several different writers during the course of its development, including a very well-known Hollywood screenwriter who has to remain anonymous or using the pseudonym of Irving Austin, because he wrote a draft for me during a strike when he wasn't allowed to write. So he had to use a pseudonym, and I'm sworn to secrecy. Who that was?
I presume you're not sworn to secrecy to tell us about how Roger Corman got involved in the project.
While I was in California, I was doing some documentaries for the BBC, largely interviewing various people. I was on the set of New York, and interviewed Marty Scorsese. And one of the things I did do was interview Roger Corman, and we filmed in Roger's wonderful house in Pacific Palisades, and walking back from the garden where we were shooting him against the mountains, I said, Roger, I had this idea for a movie, and I described the notion that I had, and he literally stopped then and there and said, I can see the poster. I'll tell you what, I'll give you half the money, you raise the rest, and shoot it in Spain. And literally, and I said, would you put that on paper, please? And he said, no problem. So we actually exchanged letters, and he gave me that contract. And it didn't quite add up to half the money, as Rob Whitehouse, who's in the audience here, our producer, will tell you. Roger, at the last minute, found a way of giving us a third rather than a half, right as we were about to start shooting, which, of course, put the production under terrible straits.
Did he come up with that rather splendid poster? There's a very nice poster out in the lobby.
That was generated, I think, by Roger's company, New World Pictures, and a particular illustrator that we had some initial concept done by John Bolton, who's a very well-known British comic book illustrator and a wonderful painter. And John and I actually worked through the movie, and John did the storyboards. And John did a kind of draft of what that poster should be, and then the American poster artist finished it, and that's what we have out in the hall.
That's great. So Roger Corman has a bit of a reputation of being very encouraging with the people that he chose to work with, but perhaps kind of making key but small changes here and there. I mean, how, once he kind of signed up to your idea, was he happy to let you get on with it, aside from this poster idea, or did he kind of...
No, Roger had an influence, some good, some bad. We had various castings, and the person who I most wanted to play the part of Hunter was Ed Harris, who had came in and did a great audition, and I was, very much wanted to work with Ed, and he liked the part and wanted to come to New Zealand. But what Roger did is, one of the other people we saw was obviously Michael Beck. Roger had one of his assistants go to the Santa Monica High School with some photographs and show them to the kids at break time, and basically did a little bit of market research about who did those kids want to go and see in a movie. And Michael Beck was prettier, and the kids went with that, and Roger went with their decision, and it was a kind of a fait accompli because he had his checkbook, and it was like, we need the boy that they chose, or I'm not going to write the checkbook. One of the good thing was that Roger kind of sat me down and kind of gave me these bits of advice that, are still valid. He said, famously, because Jonathan Demme will tell you a very similar story, sitting down and getting lessons on how to make movies from Roger. He said, sit down as much as you can, because you will never sit down enough, and if you want to maintain your stamina and get through the day, rest as much as you can, which is sensible. The other thing he said was, if you can't move the camera, get lots of coverage, because we're going to want to keep it exciting in the cutting room. And I have to say, Roger did not appear in the cutting room because all the post-production was done in Wellington, New Zealand. But he did do a kind of test screening, and he had this wonderful illuminated pen, and he would like make notes. And then after the end of the screening, he said, there are these 2 lines, and I can't remember them. He said, take them out. And I said, that's it? He said, that's it. I said, why? He said, inappropriate audience reaction. I said, really? He said, yes, they were. It wasn't the response that you want from the audience at that moment in the movie. And I think he's right. I can't remember. So
he was listening to the audience as much as
he
what
was
he was seeing on screen.
noticing them, and when they.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it was very interesting because we tested it, and it was in East Hollywood, and kind of Hollywood, but getting towards the kind of scrappy end of it. And the audience was very blue collar, very mixed, you know, Latino, Chinese, Korean, black, white, and. There was this strange swelling in the audience. When Rusty and the team build the vehicle, you really got a sense of the audience, because I was there, that they felt proud because that's what they did. They worked with their hands. And it's very interesting to test a picture with an audience, because that's who you're ultimately, you know, making the film for, and you very much feed back on their reaction. But that's what we came away with. Roger's note, take those 2 lines out, and that was it.
It's a very international picture in a way. Obviously, there's yourself and Roger's influence, and then the range of different actors. It was shot in New Zealand. I mean, were you aiming it for an American audience? I mean, with the...
You know, I was aiming it for a world audience. So we weren't specifically targeting an American audience. It was just this kind of action-adventure science fiction film. What's interesting is when we went there, we went to New Zealand largely because they had a tax credit system as an incentive to bring productions to New Zealand, and they brought many. So many that when we arrived, there wasn't really a crew left for us. So we were crewing with people who were very young to the business, very enthusiastic, and we were looking at for special effects people from all over the world who have this particular expertise. I mean, the man who did the explosives and who blew the truck up for us was the man who blew up, you know, Vietnam for Francis Coppola in Apocalypse Now. That, if you remember that scene in Apocalypse Now where the jungle erupts, it was done by the same guy who blew up our truck. But the crew that we ended up with was a great crew. They really worked hard, and I love the spirit in New Zealand where, you know, the chef, when he wasn't making lunch, was laying tracks with the rest of the grips. It was a terrific spirit, and everyone had a wonderful time making the film because we were out in this beautiful landscape. But, for example, swinging the boom was Lee Tamahori, who would then go on to make Once Were Warriors as a director and did Bond movies, and he's just recently done The Devil's Double. And as the gaffer who was basically following Chris Menge's instructions about where to put the light and where to put the camera and things like that was Stuart Dryburgh, who famously shot The Piano and went on to shoot many films and lots of television series like Boardwalk Empire, quite recently. And
well, you mentioned Chris Menges a moment ago, and
he sends his regards and apologizes. He's in the mountains of Wales where he lives, and he says he wishes he could be here, as does Una, his daughter, who plays one of the characters in the film.
But you worked together on The Empire Strikes Back. Am I right in saying that you were the second year director?
Chris and I worked together 3 times.
Okay.
First of all, it was a wonderful documentary that we did in Chicago called Chicago Streets, which was about cops, robbers, hookers, pimps, journalists, and politicians. And we very much took the point of view that we, the camera crew, were going to be a journalist on the streets of Chicago this particular summer. And we covered everything from, you know, the mayor ranting about bad press to arriving hot at a murder scene where it was my job to make sure that Chris had enough light, and there was this lake of blood in the middle of the room. And if anybody, it was shown on ATV and it won a Serval Pearl as best documentary. It's called Chicago Streets, and we're hoping, in fact, I'm negotiating with the rump of ATV, which is, I think, is now owned by, the rights are owned by ITV, to get the DVD rights to bring it out again. Chris is, I think, as close to a genius cameraman as you can get. He's a remarkable man. And the second time we worked was in doing the second unit of Empire Strikes Back, and then I brought him out to New Zealand.
I was going to ask you about that. Empire Strikes Back. The first couple of Star Wars films both had this kind of distinctive, futuristic but grubby look, which I think is here. And I wanted to ask you how much you think you brought from that experience of Empire Strikes Back, and how closely were you involved with the design? I think a very distinctive design there of the costumes, the village, the truck itself.
Well, the comparison would be interesting because Empire Strikes Back was a very expensive film. And I shot for 4 months doing the studio second unit. And I got the job in kind of tragic circumstances because a friend of mine, John Barry, who was a production designer and the designer of the first Star Wars film, died tragically from meningitis. I mean, literally, he came to work with 103 temperature at 8 o'clock in the morning one day, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon that same day, he was dead. And I turned up the next day to find production stills for that summer, a picture that I did with Ray Winstone. And I went and visited the set because I knew Chris, I knew the camera operator, David Garfath. I just arrived, and I knew John, and I wanted to say hello, and I got this terrible news, and they were upset because they have a very, very tight schedule, lots to do, and they didn't know who was going to take over and how it was all going to work, and I just casually mentioned that if there was anything I could do to help, I would. And then Gary Kurtz came downstairs and Robert Watts, and the next day I was directing the second unit. It was literally that fast.
And I mean, did you bring a lot to?
The whole notion of the future's old and dirty is something that I felt a long way back, and when I saw that George was applying this notion, it was kind of very sympathetic to me, but it wasn't that I got the idea from Empire Strikes Back. But I have to say the remarkable thing was the production designers in New Zealand, because they were scavenging. We had a nothing budget. Rob tells me that in today's money, it was like $400,000. And for example, the truck and all the vehicles was designed by Kay Hawkins, who is a remarkable designer and designed this, the New Zealand experience in some kind of tower. And it was just a remarkable guy. And all the set and the detail and it's just the layers of set dressing was done by a team that was led by Rick Coford, who's an astonishing production designer. We had so much talent out there, and they were literally working with junk. And there's one scene where the horse is driving through this kind of graveyard of wrecked vehicles.
It's great, isn't
that
it?
happened to be there.
Shot,
yeah, we didn't put it there. What was happening, there was all these wrecked vehicles, and we got it in this tiny little window when they were there, because a Japanese ship was moving through New Zealand and basically taking up all the wrecked vehicles and melting it down more or less then and there and taking it back to Japan to be turned into new cars. So the kind of look and the feel and the notion and the kind of geodesic domes, very New Zealand. It's very kind of reprocess, reuse, rework. That's a kind of an ethos there because they're very isolated. And
I read somewhere that this was the biggest set, this village was the biggest set that had ever been made for a New Zealand film, is that?
Remarkably
village,
so,
right?
and I don't condone this kind of behavior, but literally the crews would go out with a flatbed truck. They would see an old abandoned building on someone's land, these old, paddocks in the middle of, the remarkable Central Otago. That range of mountains, which looks so remarkable, is actually called the Remarkables. And they would take the chainsaws, and they were artists with chainsaws, cut the building off at the base. A couple of guys would pick it up, put it on the back of the truck, and that became part of the set. So they were recycling the landscape. They were anything that was derelict and old, it would turn up on our set.